Welcome to another episode of ITP, the International Teacher Podcast, a very unique podcast. This episode, while not going to be as funny as usual because my co-host Matt, the family guy, is off buying baseball cards or something, and I had to go at this alone as Greg, the single guy. It may not be as funny, but it will certainly be informative for you. I have the opportunity in this episode to talk to an international teacher, a traveler to many places, a great storyteller, and now the author of Pedaling to Kailash, Cycling Adventures and Misadventures Across the Roof of the World. My guest is Graydon Hazenberg, coming at us from Bali. Welcome to the International Teacher Podcast with your host, Greg, the single guy, and Matt, the family guy. We're recording episodes from around the globe to tell you about the best kept secret in education. That's right, it's teaching overseas. We're glad to have you. Welcome to our show, Graydon. I know that we were friends back in 2004. We met in Egypt. And where are you now?
So right now I'm in Bali, Indonesia. I'm between teaching gigs. I should be traveling, but COVID. But I figure that this is about as beautiful a place to wait out a pandemic as any.
Oh, Bali. And you're doing some diving there?
Yeah, we're doing a reasonable amount of diving, some sea kayaking, lots of snorkeling. It's pretty beautiful here.
What a beautiful place to be. One of the reasons I really wanted you on this show is that I look up to you as a world traveler. Like when Matt says that he's the most unlikely person ever to have left his county in Minnesota and go down to Venezuela, you are the exact opposite of Matt. You are the pinnacle of travel. How many countries have you been to so far?
I think if I was just trying to look this up before, it's either 133 or 134. I went to Panama just before the pandemic, and I think that made 133.
You're Canadian, right?
Yeah.
I was going to say you're born Canadian, but you're a world traveler. Where do you call home if you were to go back to Canada?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, my father lived in the house that I grew up in until 2017 in Thunder Bay, Ontario. So, same neck of the woods. Like we looked across Lake Superior towards Wisconsin.
That's beautiful.
Exactly. We used to get our PBS feed from there way back when. But in 2017, my father passed away and we sold the house. And so now when I go to Canada, I visit my mom in Ottawa, but it's not quite the same. It doesn't feel like home. It doesn't have those emotional connections. And my mom is probably going to move in the next year or so to Switzerland. And then it's like, what's home? What's a real home base? And I mean, I'm sure that I'll figure something out, but I feel kind of rootless right now, just as a result of my parents passing on and moving.
When people ask me where home is, I have the very same kind of answer. My parents have moved around. I was an Army brat, so I moved around all over the country in the U.S., and then I moved overseas for a little bit with my family, and we moved state to state all the time, Army bases, etc. We didn't have that feeling. Other people have the house they grew up in. Having no home, and you travel so much, you probably don't think about it. Like, I don't think about where home is because I know that when I see the right people, I feel at home. When I see my brothers, I feel them at home. When I see my mom and dad, whether it's Florida or Green Bay, I feel at home. Maybe that's the same way with you. If your mom is going to be going to Switzerland, is she an international teacher, or was she?
She was. I mean, later in life, when she turned 56 or so, 57, she got a job actually at the school in Egypt. Then she went for a couple of years to Mexico and a couple of years to Switzerland and a year to Morocco. And then she sort of retired. She was really the one who got me thinking seriously about international teaching because I thought, at the time I was teaching abroad, but I was teaching ESL in Japan. And there's only so many years you can do that before your brain just turns to pablum. And I had reached that point. I thought, I just can't do it anymore. And then I thought, if I teach high school, I can teach stuff that I know about and I'm good at teaching and I enjoy, and I can do that all over the world and not just in Japan. Because that's the beauty of international teaching is there's an international school, English language medium in probably every country in the world other than maybe, I don't know, North Korea or something. Like you can always get a job someplace interesting.
I've always said that the international teaching circuit is not just about travel. For me, it's not the travel. It's find a great school to teach at and then use that as the place to sort of branch out and travel around countries and travel around the world from there. But for you, it's a little bit different. And I think you've made it work for you a different way. Can you tell me how you do the travel and teaching and put those two together?
For me, it's sort of a combination of things. The beautiful thing about school teaching, international school teaching, is that you tend to get a couple months off in the summer. And that's enough time for a pretty good long trip somewhere. So for years, I would go pretty much every summer on a big bicycle trip to places like Mongolia, parts of the Silk Road, Vietnam, Ethiopia, places like that. And then at other times, I would say, okay, I need more time to do a really big trip. Between contracts, I would take time, like a year, a couple of years, and just go and have a massive, massive trip somewhere. I don't think I've ever done 2 contracts back to back. I took time off after Egypt, and then in 2006, I went to Myanmar. I did 3 years there, but then I took a year off to travel, and then I went and taught in Switzerland, and I was 5 years there. And then I took 3 years off after that, just traveled everywhere I wanted to go, an incredible sort of 3 years. And then 2 years in Tbilisi, Georgia, which I finished last June, with the idea of I was going back to Africa with my partner to resume a trip that we'd been doing there. But obviously with COVID, that didn't quite pan out. So when I'm teaching at a place, you've got Christmas, maybe spring break, fall break, you can do some interesting local regional trips then, and then a big trip in the summer. And then to get a really big in-depth trip, that's when I just sort of up sticks and take off for a year. That's the nice thing about international teaching is that there's not this expectation that you must do the same job for 35 years the way you do at a school board in Canada or the States. It gives you this freedom to sort of trade money for time. You give up a year of earning, but you get a year of time. And I think that's an incredible bargain for me.
So it sounds like to me is that you enjoy teaching, but what you do, your strategy is to teach somewhere for the contract or a little bit longer than the contract. Yeah. The average contract for me so far has been that they offer is 2 years, is usually the minimum. There are some schools with 1. However, I usually extend a contract a little bit. My average might be 3 now, right? I've been here 5, yeah. And you were in Switzerland for 5.
Exactly.
And what I think your style is that you work somewhere for long enough with an idea that you're going to save enough money to go between contracts for a longer period of time and do your travels and your excitement. Because it's not about the money, like you say. It's about your travels. It's about experiences. And then once you've sort of run dry or once your plan is done, you go look for another school to get hired at to work there.
That's exactly the strategy. And it's worked out really well so far. And it's kind of the perfect mix for me of time spent working and doing something I enjoy. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love teaching. I really enjoy it. But I don't want to do it every year in, year out, because I could see that definitely getting old after a while.
You're a scuba instructor like I am, and here's my caveat or my backpack on what you just said. I also, like you, I figured I would go and teach internationally, and then during the summer, when we have that summertime off, like the U.S. schools and some of the other schools around the world, I would take that 2 months or 3 months and travel around the world and get a job teaching diving, right? So I got my dive instructor. And I'm like, I'm going to start doing the diving over the summertime. But as soon as I got done with the course, and then I went on to Thailand, I got my advanced scuba, like the master scuba instructor, I got so sick of teaching PADI because I love teaching my way. And one of the PADI instructors told me during the course, Greg, quit being a teacher, just do it the PADI way. I mean, it's like this canned way of teaching, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do any more.
Yeah, I mean, you need to be a robot. You need to say all the right words, follow the script. It's like it's not as bad as it, but it's a bit like being a telephone salesman, a telemarketer.
Exactly.
Here's your script.
As much as I love PADI, as much as I love diving, I just can't teach anymore. So I love what you do, and you've made it work for yourself. You teach at schools where you can save enough money, not quite to travel on a shoestring like your one sister you mentioned in your book we'll talk about later, but you have one sister that she'll go traveling with next to nothing, right? But you make enough money to travel in style. As you get older a little bit and you and Marie are together, do you travel a little bit more in style than you used to when you were younger?
I would say, yeah. I mean, when I was in my 20s and early 30s, I camped wild a lot. I tried to spend as little money as possible. Now I'm a little more open to, after a couple of days in the wilderness, coming into a nice hotel and getting a shower and having a good meal somewhere to charge up. I mean, I'm definitely not traveling 5-star, but before I was traveling no star. Let's say now I'm on the average about 2-star.
That's fantastic. I went from sleeping under a bridge or living in a little $2 a night place in Cambodia to, going to an IHG hotel and spending, $400 for a night. I've actually done that before, and I'm going to stop. I want to go back to the camping, I think, save some money. Teaching internationally is a great caveat for you to travel, and you do both. I mean, extensively.
Yeah. And I think that it has been an amazing opportunity. I think that for me, what's nice about it is that wherever you end up teaching, you inevitably learn more about that country than you would on a brief trip. And so I've been lucky to be in a couple of 2 or 3 really fascinating countries. Myanmar, when I was there, it was still under military dictatorship. It was very politically repressive. And it's the one place I've taught where I really felt like I was making a difference. The kids I was teaching were clearly going to be the hope for the future, to build a more equitable, freer, more democratic, more prosperous society. And so the kids that I was teaching, they were acutely aware of this, just how precious this opportunity was to learn, and to learn in a very free thinking, free expression sort of setting in a country where outside the walls of the school, everybody had to keep their mouth, their lips sealed, because one loose word could end you up in jail or worse. And so we were like this little oasis of freedom. And so that was just incredible to teach these kids who were so motivated and who clearly were going to make a better country. And that's why in the last few months, it's been heartbreaking seeing what's happened in Myanmar, because, for 10 years, there was this increasing amount of freedom and democracy, and suddenly it was just snuffed out like that. And it's absolutely shattered all the dreams of all these young people whom I taught and who were doing such great things in improving the country. And so I just find that so sad. But for me, teaching those kids was by far the best teaching experience I've ever had, both in terms of having motivated students, but also just kids who you knew were going to make the most of their education. I just thought it was incredible. So for me, that was amazing. And then teaching in Georgia, where I just was, in Tbilisi, it's a country that's sort of building itself up after the Soviet years. And it's incredibly beautiful, but also the kids that you talk to, you realize they too sort of realize, maybe this is an opportunity for them to do something to make it a better country. And I think that's incredible. At other schools I've taught at, you get a few more sort of rich kids who are not that motivated sometimes. And
like Egypt.
Like Egypt, for sure. And so, it's hard to motivate yourself to teach, because, what teaching is like. You got to put in way more energy than you ever get out of it. And so if you're doing that and not getting anything back, you feel empty after a while. You just think, I'm putting all my soul and my heart and my energy in, and I'm not doing anything with it. And so that can be really hard to take. Whereas these kids in Myanmar, these kids in Tbilisi, I'm like, wow, I feel like I'm achieving something. I love that.
When I was in Egypt, we both taught in Egypt in 2004 to 2005. Well, you stayed for half a year, and I only stayed for a year. It wasn't for me. They were the top 1%ers of Egypt. It was 99% or 100% Egyptian students. Remember that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I have to share this with you. I had a terrible class, and I remember our librarian was driven out of the library. I was teaching 6th grade. They drove her out of her own classroom 3 times crying. And she had been teaching for 26 years. The other thing about Egypt that I remember is that, well, it's recently, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, one of my students, one of my boys, sends me an email and he says, Mr. Lemoine, I just wanted to write to you shortly and tell you that I apologize on behalf of the other boys in our class. We treated you horribly. I mean, this kid must have been going through like that time in college where you have to write to a teacher and they're talking to a counselor and the guy's like, oh, wait, I remember that Lemoine guy. We did terrible things to him, right? But it was a great year. In Egypt, it was about the kids were not what I was there for. I think I landed there and realized it wasn't the right fit, which is what we call about schools, right? And it was 100% host national kids. The different kinds of schools that we teach at, sometimes they could be specifically host national kids like Egypt. They could be widely international like other schools, like in Switzerland, attracts a lot of international from everywhere, right? So it does depend on what schools. But I have to remember a couple things here. Do you remember playing softball?
Yes, I do.
For the listeners, basically we had this expat community and where we lived was separate from the school. But we lived in this very expat community and we would play softball, twice a week?
Yeah.
Twice a week. And I hadn't played softball probably since middle school or thrown a baseball since maybe I was in 3rd grade. And I happen to be I'm left-handed, so I'm sitting on first base. They elect me as first baseman. I hadn't touched a baseball or a softball, anything in years. And Graydon is on 3rd base. And I remember this because I wrote it down in one of my newsletters. Graydon throws this. I wrote this down. Graydon, during the first practice, Graydon throws a rocket from 3rd base, and I have to reach out as a first baseman. I reach out and rip my shorts all the way up the crotch, trying to reach for this ball, and this ball burned my hand. I mean, it was a rocket. I'm like, this guy plays baseball. Did you play when you were a kid or high school?
Yeah, I loved baseball. I played junior ball till I was like 19 or so.
I could feel it in my hand. That burned my hand that first practice. But we went on, and you left us, but we went on to capture it. Were you at the championship? Did you go to it? I can't remember if it was all year long.
I had left by that point.
We won on your behalf then, okay? We won on your behalf, yes. Because we would go every week because the Germans made the bratwurst and they had beer for us. It was a great evening thing to do. But I was so sore after that. You're a really good throw from what I remember. Here's my other memory I have one more memory, Graydon. And this is, I have to apologize for not remembering you for you. Okay. I remember you for being the traveler, Superman, travel around the world. But here's my story about you. It's a memory that's connected to a woman because I can't get this out of my head. The most beautiful woman I've ever met. So we had this huge October party. Remember Halloween? And Mooney and I had it at our place. Everybody dressed up. What did you dress up as? Do you remember?
I think I was a tennis player. I think I was John McEnroe.
Yeah, yes, with the long hair, because he has this, Graydon has this long flowing hair. I'm jealous. Can I have some of that? So we have this rooftop party, and we planned it for a month. In fact, it was the party committee. 9 people planned this thing out. I looked up the stats. There were 99 people or 98 people at that party. We ran out of beer at midnight. It had happened right after Ramadan. So getting all the supplies and all the beer, it was tough to get. And here's the point of my story. Graydon walks in and this beautiful woman is by his side. And she was from Yemen. Is my memory correct?
Yeah.
This woman
Your
is
memory
the
is very
most
good.
beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life. And it wasn't anything, to tell you the truth, except her eyes. She had green eyes. And when you left her for a second to go get a drink, I moved in and I was like, and I just wanted to talk to her. I was like, where are you from? And she said, from Yemen. I melted right there, dude. I swear to God. I was so jealous of Graydon Hazenberg. That was the one time in my life that I've been more jealous of any man. I was like, this woman could have said anything. I would have jumped right off the roof. All right? I swear to God.
She bore an uncommon resemblance to Penelope Cruz, but a better looking Penelope Cruz. And with, like you said, incredibly expressive almond eyes.
Oh my God,
so,
that was beautiful.
Very beautiful.
So those are my memories, man. I know we taught at the school in Egypt together, and you were there for 6 months. I was there for a year. How do you choose your schools now, Graydon? Do you look at the student body and look to see whether it's host national or a mix, or do you care?
It depends. I mean, ideally, I want to be at a school that's not a for-profit school, especially one that's sort of like single owner, because that can result in sort of bad
fit. And it's a bad fit because you left after 6 months because of that, because that's what the school was.
I mean, I had awful students, awful classes. And I think also, location, I want it to be someplace interesting that I don't know very well. I talk to people who are teaching there and just try and get a feel for the vibe of the place. Because if you're going to be there for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, you don't want to be in a place that's just not interesting. And so I want to hear from people who are teaching at the school, what do you guys do on the weekend? What's the social life like? What do people do when they get out of the city? I also worked once at a boarding school. A Swiss school is a boarding school. And I just found that too intense because you're living and working all in the same place. You have all these extra duties on weekends and the evenings. And
you live for the school. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, basically you're owned 24/7 by the school. And I mean, I enjoyed Switzerland. I had a great time, but I don't think I would ever go back to a boarding school. It's just too hard. And some people love it. More power to them, but I'm not among them. And so, interesting place, good fit. I hope that it's a place that has reasonable academic standards. Like I love teaching IB and AP and stuff. Just a place where I know that you've got a lot of reasonably contented teachers. If you're at a school where everybody doesn't enjoy it, they don't like the administration, they don't like the students, they're grumbling, that's not a good fit. That's not something that you want to wake up and go off to work at every day, right? Like, I think that it's really important to be at a place where a lot of the teachers really enjoy it and where you have a good relationship with the students. Because, I mean, it's the students you spend all your time with, right?
Yeah.
And so you don't want to have a class like you described, or like I had in Egypt as well, where they're sort of going out of their way to make your life as miserable as possible.
And once again, that's that one school experience that we had, and I don't like to talk negative either about it, and I try not to, but that was just one school experience, one fit that didn't work for you and didn't work for me either.
There were a lot of people there who had a much different experience, who really enjoyed it, who stayed for a long time. And that's the thing about international school teaching, is very individual. What's an amazing school for one person can just be awful for somebody else. And so you got to learn to figure out what it is that's going to make it great for you, and try and figure it out ahead of going there rather than 6 months after you arrive where you're like, oh man, what did I think?
I don't know if you remember back then, but Mooney, who was my roommate, played on our softball. Also Trevor. Yeah. I called him the Jolly Green Giant and the Midget because we were walking around one night looking for this, party, and it was Trevor's huge, right? He's a tall guy. Yeah. He's in Saudi Arabia at a school. And then Mooney has been up in, I don't know if he's still there. I'm pretty sure he is. He's almost 10 years now. He's been up in Russia, and he's been at the Anglo-American school. And I think there's like 4 or 5 people that we taught with in Egypt that are up there at the same time. There's a little cohort of them that transferred over. Yeah. Look, how do you do your research for these schools? Is it just word of mouth because you've been so many places in so many years?
To a certain extent. I mean, whenever I'm teaching someplace, I'm always asking my fellow teachers, where have you taught before? What was it like? How did you enjoy it? And so that's an invaluable resource, right? Like, and the more schools you teach at, the more people you meet, the more you hear. I mean, I look at stuff like the ECIS website and schools' individual websites. Like if I hear about a place, I just kind of look it up. Sometimes it's through students, actually. Like I'll have a student who was at a different school before, and they'll say, I think you would really enjoy teaching there, sir. And I say, oh, why? Oh, well, it's close to the mountains, there's nice skiing, or there's incredible history or whatever. And so I think, oh, that's interesting. I look it up. What I've been lucky with, I think, is because I teach high school math and physics, there's always a pretty high demand for that. I can be a bit choosier than I could at the beginning of my international school teaching career. Because, I know that it's something in high demand. And so if I apply for a job, there's a higher chance that I'm going to get it just because there's not going to be that much competition for it because there's a smaller supply and a greater demand. That's nice in that I don't feel desperate. I don't feel like, oh, the first offer that I get, I've got to jump on it. And I think that is really important when you're teaching, to have some agency, to feel like I've got a short list of 5 or 10 schools and I've done my homework. They all sound pretty good. And so if one of them offers me something good, I'll take it. Because I remember my first job fair, I got offered 3 jobs. One in Colombia, which sounded interesting but was paying peanuts. One in Mexico, which was paying a bit more, but it didn't sound like a super exciting place to be. And one was Egypt. And I thought, well, Egypt is the most exotic place, so I should go there. But after that, I went to one more fair before I went to Myanmar. And then the jobs I've had since then, I've kind of done privately, just contacted schools directly and said, look, if you're looking for math and physics, I'd like to apply. And I found the job in Switzerland and the job in Tbilisi that way both times. And that's been really good because when you go to a fair, it's just this whirlwind of so many schools. And, in 24 hours, you might get 5 or 6 different offers and you got to make up your mind just then. And that's hard. It's hard to know that you're making the right choice when you're in this pressure cooker environment. I mean, how many job fairs have you been to?
Well, let's see. I've been to 3 UNI fairs, and I've been to, I think, 3 ISS fairs. So I love it.
Okay.
That's my style of doing it because I think it's the game for me, and it's it's sort of what my book is going to be about, is how to win at the job fair. Because I've seen the gamut. I mean, I started in Honduras and made nothing. I made like $12,000 a year, but I loved it there, and I made a life there, and it was fantastic. But I knew nothing about the job fair, nothing at all. I barely had a resume set for it. I didn't know what to expect. But my last job fair that I walked into at that fair, I was the first one to land a job the night before the jobs even got offered. And I just spent the rest of the fair there helping other people because that's sort of my thing. Like, get them through what you're saying, get them through that pressure cooker that it turns out to be. But I thrive on that game. I've seen that game so many times, and there's so many things that at some point I want to work with ISS or Shirley, or if I want to work with you and I, whatever it is. But I have one more question for you related to recruiting too. And you have a partner now, right?
Yeah.
And is it Marie?
Yeah, Marie.
How does she fit into your recruiting? Is she also a teacher, or?
She's also a teacher. We met in Switzerland, in Lausanne. So Lausanne is this little tiny village, 3,000 people, but it has 2 international schools and an international post-secondary school as well. And so I was at one of the international schools and she was at the other. And so we met there and we became an item. Then after that, we traveled for 3 years. And then when I got my job in Tbilisi, she thought about whether she wanted to work that year, but decided that, in fact, she had been working solidly for like 20 years and had saved very well, and she didn't have to work. And so she decided to take a couple of years of not teaching and doing other stuff. So she's running a school for disadvantaged kids in Zambia right now. And so she's been doing that for like 15 years, but it's become a much bigger concern. Like she started with literally 15 kids under a tree. And now there are 350, 400 kids. Trying to run that remotely takes quite a bit of effort. And it's something she enjoys. Like that is an incredible project to try and bring education to these kids who barely have enough to eat. She really enjoyed having the opportunity to spend more time on that. And so I'm not sure when I'm going to teach again, but if I do, I'm not sure if Marie's going to want to teach or if she'll come along and run her own projects while she's there. It's not clear. Everything is so up in the air right now with COVID. I honestly don't know where I'm going to be in 6 months' time or 12 months' time. It's so hard to predict.
But I tell you what, even if it wasn't COVID, if you asked me, and people ask me this all the time, they say, Greg, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I just literally laugh at them. I don't know about next week. There's not a week that, and you can attest to this too, in international teaching and travel, both things that you do, there's not a single day that goes by that's not different than what I thought it would be. I can't plan a whole lot, right? You can plan like a teacher, but you can't plan out your life because things happen. I mean, just out of the blue, things happen that you have no control over, and you have to roll with it and adapt, right?
I think of a friend of mine who was a teacher who went to, where did she go? She went to Burkina Faso. And she was... Which
is Africa, right? That's also Africa. Is that East Africa? West Africa, okay.
Well, West Africa. It's sort of north of Nigeria. North of Ghana, I guess, really. Anyway, she went there and she was enjoying teaching there. And then suddenly there was a coup. And there was fighting. And there was a counter coup. And the army came in and sacked the school, sacked all the students or the teachers' houses, burned the school to the ground, and that was the end of that school. And so she had to go find another job, and she got a job in Tunisia. And then that's a few months after she arrived, that school, there was a big anti-government demonstration, and that school got burned to the ground. And so, I mean, you just don't know what's going to happen. Like, if you had asked her just before everything went down in Burkina Faso, she probably would have said, in 5 years, maybe I'll still be here. Well, actually, in 6 weeks, you're not going to be there anymore. And so you just can't predict it, right? Oh. And so you got to learn to just go with the flow. Countries have revolutions, economies crash, pandemics happen.
I keep going back to Egypt, too, and you and I both taught with that school, and we know that guy owns several schools. Did I ever tell you the story about my recruitment, like when I met them at the fair in you and I?
No. They
offered me a position in Gaza. I had already talked to people that had taught in Gaza, but at the time, Gaza was closed. And I said, how could I said, is your school even open? He says, no, but inshallah, and I hate that word. He goes, inshallah, we will open it in 6 months. I want to hire my staff. And I looked at him, I said, I can't accept a position at a school that's not even open. I looked at him and he's crazy. In turn, I said, listen, if you give me the opportunity to teach at your school, I will do a great job and impress you, and we can revisit the idea of going to Gaza. I said, I'll sign up for your Gaza school, and if I enjoy the one in Egypt. And of course that burned, and whatever. I mean, burned in a sense that my contract burned. Yeah. I hated it. So I would have never taught with him in Gaza. But since then, I had met other people like Crystal, who was teaching with us in elementary in Egypt. She and her husband, Dave, had been teaching in Gaza for 2 years. They loved it. They had a few stories about rockets being launched and hiding from things coming over the wall from Israel. But I don't know. It's tough to say. I guess our point is, and your point is, you can never really gauge what your next day, your next week, your next year is going to be. Like I say, what's your next school? Because it's going to come along and you can't plan that. And right now you're having a good time in Bali anyway. Right? Taking some pictures underwater, and oh my God, I'm jealous. What a great place to be for COVID.
I'm so lucky that my partner 10 years ago had the foresight to get a place here, because it's been an amazing place to hide out. So it's the second time we've spent time here, and yeah, it's there are a lot worse places to kick back and wait.
Well, I will tell you this, though. You have to have a list, I'm sure, and maybe she has the same list that you do, but on your list of travels, you said you've been to 133. That's amazing, 134. Yeah. Do you have any in your next couple of years that you do want to go visit, whether it's for a bike travel or if it's just to go and explore?
Well, the idea for this year was that we were going to go back to Africa where we have a truck with a camper and continue a trip we had been doing a few years ago before I went to Tbilisi. And so I wanted to go up East Africa all the way to the top, go into Europe and come down West Africa. So that's still on the cards. We're just waiting for borders to open and rules to become clear. After that, I've never really been to most of Central America, like never been to Costa Rica, never been to Guatemala. I would love to go there. And Colombia and Ecuador, I've never been to. And, I love Latin America, and those two countries are full of nature, full of diving and mountains and birds and stuff. And so I'd love to go there. Then I'm sort of running out of big areas of the world. I guess the Caribbean. I've never been to the Caribbean, which is amazing for someone who loves diving. Then I've got little countries here and there that I didn't hit when I was in the area. And so I sort of have mopping up operations. But I would love, like in 15 years, to be able to say, okay, that's it. I've been to all the countries in the world that I can go to. So we'll see. Fingers crossed.
Well, I have a couple. I do have one piece of advice for you. You're talking about Caribbean. My New Year's resolution, I think I mentioned this to you before, but my New Year's resolution back in 2000 or 2001 was to wake up in a new country every year. I spent one New Year's, I woke up on Bonaire. And Bonaire is the little ABCs, the Dutch islands, the Dutch Antilles in the Caribbean. And the reason I mentioned to you is I had the most wonderful trip. I went alone. And I went to this place called Buddy Dive Shop. Buddy has Buddy Reef on there, and it's a dive and drive island. So you and Marie could rent a pickup truck, and they have a drive-through service with their nitrox and their regular air tanks. Pick up your tanks, go to your little dive site. It's walk in, so bring some booties, and you walk in and you do your dive, and then you walk back out, and you get back in your truck after your two dives, go back, fill up new tanks, and you can do it all day on nitrox. And if you have your dive partner with you, you don't have to worry. I had to find people to dive with. But Bonaire was a beautiful place for New Year's. I loved it. I spent about a week there and dove. Aruba is more the beaches. Bonaire is all about the diving. And Curacao is all about the nightlife. So they each have their own little charm. But for the diving especially, you could do that. And I can't wait to see you go down to South America and Central America because there are so many places to go. And I want to go to the Antarctic. If you want to join Mooney and I, they're trying to get a trip from the former Cairo group to go travel down and see the penguins. Yep. Have you been there already?
When Marie and I left Switzerland, that was one of the first places we went. We traveled a bit in Europe, and then we went straight down to Ushuaia. And if you do it, you must do a trip that also includes the Falklands and South Georgia because those are in a lot of ways even more impressive than Antarctica itself in terms of wildlife and birds and scenery. And so if you can do a trip that's the trifecta of those three, you can pretty much give up traveling at that point because you've just seen the most incredible part of the planet.
Your bar is so high right now. I mean, to set the bar for you, but you are very easily entertained and you could probably take any situation and make it a great situation. I'm the same kind of traveler. I know you are. Just anything that happens, you're going to find the happy point of it. I can tell that from your book too, right? There's a point of interest. It's whatever. I'm going to make the best out of it. And you mentioned Ushuaia. I'm teaching with somebody from Ushuaia right now. Her parents are from Ushuaia of all places. I had never heard of it before. I know, but international teaching, you meet people from everywhere. And that's the other reason that you look at those countries too and you say, I'm going to go visit that place, right? I'm going to go there. And I do the same thing. Have you ever met somebody famous while you've been traveling around, just like out of the blue? You didn't even know it was going to happen.
I didn't meet him personally, but one day when I was walking through the streets of Tallinn in Estonia at the end of a bicycle trip, I was strolling along and I could tell that there was a big meeting or gathering in a park. And I thought, I wonder what's going on. and I walked in, and it was the Dalai Lama giving a speech.
Oh,
and
my God.
I'm a huge fan of Tibetan Buddhism and of the Dalai Lama. And so just completely randomly, I found myself sitting there listening to him. And so I can't say that I met him, but that was definitely the most famous person that I just randomly ran into.
Dalai Lama.
And so, so that was quite amazing. I mean, I know other people who will say, oh, I met this movie star or this famous politician just trekking in Nepal or something, but I can't quite match those stories.
Yeah, and it's not a competition. I figured because you've been so many places, you just never know who you're going to run into. And I'm not a stargazer. I mean, I really don't care either. I mean, the Dalai Lama, oh my God, that would be fantastic, even be in the same city as him. I was down in Buenos Aires when they named the new pope, who happens to be from Argentina. And all of a sudden, and we were talking about this before, next thing I know, we're walking down the street. There's not a parade. There's like a group of people coming at us. And think about the news. Sometimes you see groups of people with signs coming out. And I'm thinking rockets. I'm thinking tear gas. I mean, there was an actual demonstration, but it was a positive one about the Pope being named Pope, right?
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. And it was just weird. And I didn't meet the guy, but my mind works like that when we tell stories. We talked about diving, and I remember this story. It's so strange, I thought I'd share it with you. I was in Australia, in Adelaide for New Year's, back to my New Year's resolution. And I had to see the leafy sea dragon underwater. And I had bought this iPhone case, and I'm sitting at the big hotel there, Intercon. Remember we talked about, like, I've moved up in my travels? The whole circle of conversations coming together. I was sitting in the bar on Christmas Day with nothing to do, so I'm trying to figure out how my camera works, the iPhone works in the camera case. I was taking a picture of this plastic plant on the bar. I'm taking pictures of this plastic plant while I drink a beer alone on Christmas. The woman next to me, I know, the guy next to me, there's a woman between us. The guy leans over past the woman and he looks at me and goes, "What the hell are you doing?" I look over and I start talking to him, explaining that I'm here to look for the leafy sea dragon and I want to dive with sharks and I have an iPhone, et cetera, trying to work on focusing. And he goes, "Just a second." And the other two people ask him a question, and then he stands up and takes a picture with the guy. And the woman that's between us leans over to me and she goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry. He's famous. He has to do this once in a while." And I was like, "Oh, okay, whatever. I don't recognize the guy." He comes back to us, and the three of us, the woman and I and this guy, start talking to each other. And it turns out, well, anyway, we talk for like 3 hours. We're talking, and maybe not 3, 2 hours. We're sitting here buying each other drinks. Yeah. And I said, "Who are you? I mean, your wife or girlfriend, you're a woman here. She said that you're famous, and I apologize, but I have to ask." Yeah. And he goes, "Well, did you ever hear about the Little River Band?" And I said, "Well, yeah, the Albatross is my brother. Cool change, man." He goes, "Yeah, that's my song." And it turned out to be Glenn Sharrock. And Glenn Sharrock spent like 7 years touring in the 70s with the Little River Band. And he wrote that song, which is one of my favorites for diving, right? It's all about the environment. Funny. Yeah. It's about being out on the cool water being by yourself and contemplative, and you're around nature. It's a perfect dive, like on the boat out to a dive. Listen to that song and you're just like in heaven. Here's this guy sitting here that made it and wrote it. So we sat there for a couple hours talking about life, and it was just strange. At the end, he just says, "Nice to meet you, Greg." And I'm like, "Nice to meet you, Glenn. I hate to ask you this after this whole thing, but my dad is a big fan. Can I just have a picture with you to prove that I met you?" And Glenn goes, "For you, Greg?" He goes, "Of course I will." Oh, it just sort of brings everything together. I'm not a stargazer. I loved listening to his stories. He's just a guy. And he's like, "I made more money than God. I mean, I don't know what to do with all of it." And there were the fires were happening at that time in Australia too. So the whole country was ablaze. That was just a year and a half ago. Yeah, right?
I remember those.
Yeah, he was escaping Sydney. He and his partner had come down to stay for a little bit in Adelaide and get away from the fires, because that whole country was on fire. I couldn't hold a koala bear because the whole country's on fire. I want to do is hold a koala bear and say, "I hold a koala bear," interview a kangaroo. See the leafy sea dragon. Oh, that's another thing you need to do is travel around that entire country. I bet you have already, but it's so huge.
Oh, it's enormous. I actually did that in between undergrad and grad school. I took a year and went and did a working holiday in Australia and had just a fantastic time. I sold encyclopedias door to door, which I can highly recommend never doing as a job. Did not enjoy it. But I traveled all around the country, but not to the West. And so years later, I went back and bought a really old Holden car and drove from Perth up to Darwin. And yeah, I loved my time in Australia. But yeah, the size of the country, it's as big as Canada, but you can drive all the way around the whole thing. Whereas Canada, you can drive along the south and that's kind of it. So you can put so many thousands of miles on a car and still not get to the other side of the country.
Well, I tell you, one other thing I need to mention to you. You need to go to see the leafy sea dragons in Adelaide, but then I want you to take this little itty-bitty plane flight down to the west over the bay and go out with Rodney Fox. And he's very famous for his great white shark dives. He's the guy that originally back in the 60s, he was a fisherman and sport fishing in a competition, and he got bitten by a great white. So like his whole, you know who I'm talking about, yeah?
I've heard this guy. He has terrible scars on his.
Absolutely, but he's like the pinnacle of the ecology of saving the great white. I went out for 2 different excursions to see the great whites, had the greatest time on the Rodney Fox, and I would imagine anybody would love to do it.
I would love that.
Yeah, he's very interesting. It's like having your own Shark Week, right? You're sitting on their boat. Everything's about sharks and great whites. Yeah. They name them. They've named over 400 different sharks. They tell you about it.
That's astonishing.
Yes. And because of COVID, the sharks are returning in great numbers now. If you go in, you have to go around April or May, and that's when the big females come in. You learn so much about sharks. And he's written a book. I mean, you got to do Rodney Fox tours.
That sounds like a pretty good combination for Adelaide's leafy sea dragons and great white sharks.
Changed my life. That was my 50th birthday present to myself because I'm a traveler like you. I said, I'm going to travel to Australia. And I did that. And the coolest thing was it's the first time I've ever been on a plane, and you've been on many planes. I'm on this little puddle jumper, right? Just over the bay. And the lady I hadn't set anything up. I knew I was going to stay overnight. I had just done on the internet, but when I arrived, I didn't have a ride, and that's okay. You go with the flow. Before I got off the plane, I'm sitting here. We're 10 minutes up. It's a 23-minute flight, and the stewardess comes on. She says, if anybody would like to have a taxi when we land, please touch the button and get our attention, and we'll put you on our list. It's the first time I've ever had a flight attendant ask to help me with a taxi. It's because they don't have taxis waiting. So the pilot calls ahead and says, we need 5 different taxis.
I love travel like that. That's on such a small scale, a human scale. I like that a lot.
One of my highlights from that trip also was in between diving, I couldn't go out. It was New Year's, and I sat down with some other divers to just talk, some other Westerners, and we're all talking. And this Aborigine guy walks over and sits down at my table and starts pouring a beer from my pitcher. And I just looked at him and I said, how you doing? He goes, I'm doing okay. And he starts telling me stories about living out in the bush and asking me what I think of Australia. And I was like, okay. And he just kept drinking beer and I kept buying more. I was like, why not? I'll buy as much beer as you want if you sit here and tell me stories. You're an Aborigine. I mean, I've seen you in magazines, National Geographic, right?
I always find that when you're traveling, it's so often these random encounters with somebody that end up being the most memorable. Not something that you planned and researched and made all these decisions for. It's something that happens on the spur of the moment. And you have these incredible conversations with someone that you'll never see again, but that will stick in your mind forever. And that is one of the great things about travel, is that kind of encounter. For me, I would say when I was riding my bicycle across the Silk Road from China to Turkey, I was always being put up by people. Like, they would just say, hey, you must stay at my place. So one day in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan, middle of nowhere, My friend and I are bicycling along, and it's the middle of the summer, but we're in high mountains and we get hammered by a blizzard. It's cold. It starts to rain, then it turns to snow, and we're frozen to the skin, and we're shivering. And through the blizzard, we suddenly see this tent, this yurt, one of these felt summer tents that people live in. And the guy standing outside says, "You look really cold. Come on in." And we spend the night with him because it's getting late. There's no way we can continue. And him and his mom were speaking in Russian, which luckily I had studied some Russian in university. And
Хорошо.
we had this long conversation about everything, about corruption, about life in the mountains, about whether life was better under the Soviets or now that it's an independent country, about why I wasn't married and how the mother was going to set me up with a Kyrgyz wife. If I came back next summer, we would have a wedding. And this conversation went on for such a long time. We had dinner and we all fell asleep in this yurt. And so this person I had never met before 5 o'clock, by 9 o'clock was my best friend. And it was fantastic. I just learned so much about Kyrgyz society and culture just from that one conversation. And it's always stuck with me.
Well, I guess it's partially because you're a traveler and you're not in a car, you're on bikes at that point, right? You're not a threat to them. And I've met other people where I'm just walking along or I'm staying at some little slummy little out of the way hotel or somewhere and I run into other people. There's no threat there because you're a traveler, they're a traveler, or maybe they're from there.
Yeah.
And I have some stories to match like that too, but not enough time. I know there's so many stories, Graydon. Tell us a little bit about your book, Graydon.
Okay, so it's a book I wrote many years ago. I did a trip by bicycle with my sisters and their partners across Pakistan and Tibet, across all the sort of highest mountain ranges of the world. And a couple of years after that, I wrote a book about it. So in about 2002, and then could not get a publisher interested. And I spent a few years trying to get publishers, and then I kind of gave up on it, put it in a drawer and moved on. And then this past year with lockdown and the pandemic, I thought I should do something useful with all this time. And so I pulled it out, dusted it off, brought it up to date, rewrote parts of it, and self-published it. And so it came out a couple months ago. It's called Pedaling the Kailash, Cycling Adventures and Misadventures Across the Roof of the World. And I'm super excited. It's just been so much fun finally releasing the book out into the world.
Where were you when you were writing the book? Like you did your trip through Pakistan and into, along the Kailash, but where did you end up writing the book after that?
So I wrote the book in several places. In 2002, I was traveling. I had just done a year of bicycle touring. That winter in Switzerland, I visited my mother, who was teaching at an international school, spent a couple months writing there, went to India, spent a couple months writing on the beach and in the mountains. And then later that year, I had been traveling some more. Another leg of a bicycle trip. I got sick. I had to go back to Canada. And at my mom's house and at my dad's house, I sort of put the finishing touches on it. So it was sort of over the course of 2002. And then I rewrote it last year, basically here in Indonesia mostly.
And what I like about it most, I just read it, and you can get it on Amazon. We'll put the notes, of course, in there for everybody. But what I like about it most, Graydon, is that you didn't just talk about a bike trip. You don't just talk about your sisters and their partners at the time, or you don't just talk about yourself. And you include all your good stories about the noise and the pollution and your bike flats and your sicknesses and starvation. But what I like, especially my point is that you are a great writer because you also include so much about the culture and the language of the places and the tribes and the people that you met along the way. There's historical, there's geopolitical stuff in there, historical, right? Information's amazing. I guess there's no question there.
Well, I was going to say, that was what I wanted to write. I wanted to try and weave it together because I think that people like hearing the stories about the disasters and the flat tires and getting arrested and dodging the police and that sort of thing. But you also want to learn something from it. And so maybe it's a little bit like teaching, right? Like if you give a really fun lesson in school, the kids are going to have fun. They're going to laugh. They're going to remember it. But at the end, you also want them to learn something, to get something out of it. So maybe that's what I want with the book too, is that I hope it's a bit funny and amusing and adventurous, but at the same time, I want people to realize what an amazing corner of the world it is, like from languages, religions, the landscape, all that stuff it's some of the most incredible places in the world. And so I wanted people to come away from the book going, hey, that sounds like a cool part of the world.
Well, I felt like I was reading it from a historical point of view, almost from a history teacher, not a math teacher, which I met you as a math teacher. But here's the cool thing, too. I absolutely learned one thing, and then I'm going to give a foreshadowing for them to read the book. We won't give anything away, but I did read in there that you learned about the Hunzakut? The Hunzakut, if you can remember back then. And they speak Burushaski.
Yeah.
And you say it has 4 genders.
Yeah.
I'm like, wow. Male, female, and we're not talking about the genders in the States. We're talking about there's like male, female, probably non-gender, like a door or something. And then
I have no idea. It's just like, it is such a strange language, utterly unrelated to everything around it. Like ordinarily you go to a remote corner of the world and they speak an unusual language, but the people in the next valley, they probably speak a language that's at least somewhat similar. There's got to be, and there, no. It's like it's its own thing that just popped out of the landscape into existence.
I love that.
It is so strange. Yeah. No, it is it's an amazing part of the world. And Hunza is like where the myth of Shangri-La sort of came from. And, they trade on that from tourism point of view, but it really is an amazing part of the world. I loved it.
Well, at some point in my life, I have to travel there. I want to touch one part of the book. 5 people left on the trip, right? The Lord of the Rings. And you guys are the dorks, right? You were called the extreme dorks. Okay, and
exactly,
I won't give away the whole story, but 5 people left on the trek, and only 4 made it until 3 years later somebody else did, right? I want to leave a cliffhanger there. Is that true? Is that what happened? Some person
absolutely
went back to finish the trip?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't leave a trip unfinished. It hangs over your head.
That's my advertisement idea for you. It's 5 people leave, only 4 people finish the trip.
Yeah, and I like that.
All right.
Yeah, no team member left behind.
But is there another way people get in touch with you, or?
Well, if you go to my website, graydonhazenberg.ca, you can see a bunch of photos I've taken from all my trips. You can get in touch with me through there. There's contact forms. You can read about my book. You can see maps of some of the places I've been. And that's probably the best way to get hold of me. So graydonhazenberg.ca for Canada.
All right, and we'll put that in the notes of the podcast. Is there anything else you want to talk about? I mean, we've talked for a long time now.
I think that teaching abroad is a ton of fun. You do too. But in addition to that, I find it also just kind of deeply satisfying and a level beyond just the fact that you have a really enjoyable life is also you really engage with the world. You learn so much. And I think that, as a teacher, you're always trying to get other people to learn. But if you yourself aren't actively learning stuff at the same time, often you lose the edge that you need to be a good teacher. If you feel like, I'm not learning anything out of this. And living abroad is just so stimulating. You are constantly surrounded by new experiences, new sounds, new languages, new cultures. And I can't think of anything that's better for keeping your enthusiasm in teaching than teaching abroad. I mean, I've never taught in Canada. I only got my teaching degree so that I could go abroad. I think that I wouldn't be as good a teacher in Canada as I have been abroad, just because I wouldn't be constantly forced to think about stuff and to deal with unexpected situations. I think I'd be too comfortable to be a really, really good teacher. But maybe that's my prejudice because I want to be traveling anyway. But I do think that what you learn from teaching abroad is almost more important than just the fun and the travel. It's an incredibly rewarding experience. And that's why I think everybody who teaches should at least consider it at some point.
The very end of your book, it says here, it's a quote from a guy that you met on Corfu, and it says, "You can always make more money. You can never make more time. So make the most of the time that you have." And you said, "I could not agree more." That's straight from the last page of your book. I love it. It describes me. It describes you. I think it's perfect, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, I was 19 when that guy told me this, and it has stuck with me ever since. I mean, it's true. Time is inelastic. You can't have more of it, so you got to make the most of it. Every day, every hour, every year. And it's so easy to not do it. And so I think about that sometimes and try and force myself to do stuff, thinking, I'm never getting this hour or this day back, so I better do something memorable with it.
Well, I love it. I've had so much fun talking with you, and we'll continue this communication well beyond podcasting. Thank you for being on the show, Graydon. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it has been fantastic. Thank you so much for having me as a guest, and I look forward to hearing many more of your podcast episodes because I think that it's an amazing project that you're doing.
Well, I think we're going to have to check back in with you on another episode along the way because we're going to have many more travels ahead of us and more stories too.